The intellectuals of the first century of the Christian era were influenced by the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. One of the concepts that was particularly important was the notion of an organized universe that had its origin in causes. These causes were intangible patterns and elements of a divine geometry. Aristotle, however, was not so interested in intangibles because these were concepts that could not be argued about. Therefore, Aristotle set out to emphasize tangible concepts that could be argued about. He wanted to examine what was knowable. Subsequently, there could never be a complete meeting of the minds between the two men, Plato and Aristotle. What exactly determined the interval between universals and particulars? This was the intellectual setting of the first century A.D. It would open up a debate about how to reconcile the two extremes, to link cause to effect and effect to cause. The debate would lead to the rise of a school of intellectuals that eventually produced Gnosticism. Gnosticism can best be defined as a philosophy of emanations, or emanationism. The attempt to bring together cause and effect led to the creation of a bridge between the two. The ancients reconciled the existence of four elements. The most solid of these was earth, and the most dense was air. The highest of the elements was the least material, and that element was spiritual. Spirit is unknowable, but from it proceeds all things spiritual in a descending order. Extensions of spirit include intellect and then energy. Energy is subject to greater limitation, however, because it is definable, whereas intellect is intangible. As each spiritual quality departs from its own substance and cause, it becomes less spiritual. In the same way, each material thing becomes less material as it departs from its substance and source, matter. Emanationism assumes there exist two co-eternal realities, spiritual on the one hand and material on the other. Because Aristotle accepted the existence of two eternal principles, he was able to relate to the Church's doctrine of good and evil and the perpetual warfare between the two. Of course, once one accepts the notion of the two realities, the question arises of whether spirit is the highest degree of matter, or is it after the lowest degree of spirit? Are both of the same general essence, and is the difference only one of degree? Do they depend on each other to any extent? Can they affect change in one another? These are questions that the scholars grappled with endlessly. Plato's theory was that matter was an extension of spirit, and as such, it was the part of spirit that was the most remote. He used the analogy of light and darkness to explain this. Darkness is the absence of light. It is not a principle. But the followers of Aristotle argued that darkness could also be a principle, and light could equally be regarded as the absence of darkness. This raised additional issues that complicated the matter even further. Which came first, darkness or light? Whichever did come first must contain the potential of the other, it would seem. Is absence then greater, or presence? If these are both co-eternal and codependent, with absence always in excess of presence, which is the more real? In order to understand the Gnostic concept of the deity, we need to compare how both pagan cultures which preceded Christianity and early Christians saw God. Most pagan systems thought of the supreme spiritual power as identical with the substance and nature of space, complete fullness. Therefore, they defined God as no thing, not emptiness, but the abstraction of forms, universal life unmanifested, undifferentiated, and undefinable. To the Christians, however, God was a person. God was not universal life unmanifested, but instead was a person that was separate from the world. This God formed the world and ruled over it in all its forms. Each of the forms had its own soul, which was given to it by the deity. The critical difference between the pagan viewpoint and the Christian viewpoint, then, is that to the pagans, God was a power emerging through the processes of spiritual and material generations, and to the Christians, he was a separate force who controlled the process of creation and ruled over it with his divine will. This is where the beliefs of the Gnostics and the pagan groups converged. The Gnostics believed the universe to be the body of God, through which spiritual power manifested and carried out the process of unfoldment and growth. But as they tried to explain Christian mystical philosophy according to this tradition, they angered both pagans and Christians alike. This is why Gnosticism became a great heresy in the history of the church, and why the church fathers tried to root it out. They found it especially offensive that the Gnostics called attention to those non-Christian sources and elements which had contributed to the rise of Christianity. Early bishops such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, and Tertullian formulated vicious and slanderous attacks upon all who dissented from the Orthodox Creed. As a matter of fact, they were expected to do so in order to prove their own allegiance to the faith. This is why they took pains to smear the Gnostic movement as one that spread hateful and misleading doctrines. They pointed out that it was the devil himself who was behind the teachers of Gnosticism and the promulgation of their false doctrines. The church fathers thus focused on refuting all of the doctrines of the heretics. The church despised Gnosticism because it interpreted Christian mysticism in the metaphysical terms of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Chaldeans. But Gnosticism was also despised by contemporary pagan philosophers such as the Neoplatonists because the Gnostics accepted some of the tenets of Christianity. It is probably due to this rejection by both sides that the history of Gnosticism was a struggle for survival. However, it is in part because of the church fathers and their caustic diatribes against heresy that some of the teachings of Gnosticism survive. The church fathers went into elaborate details about the heresies of the Gnostics when they wrote about them. The three Gnostic leaders who were most maligned were Simon Magus, Basilides, and Valentinus. Their attackers even claimed that the men only pretended to be virtuous, but that in fact it was the devil himself who created this illusion. The Gnostics were attacked vigorously because they possessed the true esoteric secrets of the early church. The church, however, proved a formidable adversary. The Gnostic theology began as a simple cult and evolved into an elaborate and complex philosophy. It split off into numerous divisions. The central idea, however, was the ascent of the soul through successive stages of being. The Gnostics borrowed from the Babylonian system of a series of heavens, each of which was ruled by a planetary god. Gnosticism taught that there's a ladder of the worlds upon which souls ascend and descend, and this was known as Jacob's ladder. The soul must ascend through the heavens and their gates. In order to access the gates, the soul had to possess magical passwords that would be given to the beings that guarded the doors. According to Gnostic thought, Christ himself is described as descending through 7 worlds on his way to incarnation into a physical body on earth. The goal of the soul is ascension into an abstract state, not unlike the condition of non-being of Buddhist doctrine. Gnostic emanationism is the birth of all natures from their own superiors and creation itself emerging from its own cause, the absolute. How then do the Gnostics conceive of God? The first emanation is called the universal logos. This logos is unknowable and incorruptible. From the logos is projected an image, and this image ordains all things. From his eternal soul and imperishable nature are emitted 3 hypostases. Simon Magus called these incorruptible form, the great thought, and the universal mind. Later Gnostics represented the Godhead as 3 potencies: Anthropos, the man; Anthropos, son of Anthropos, the man, son of the man; and Yaldabaoth, the son of chaos. Yaldabaoth, who would be Zeus in the Orphic tradition and in Platonic metaphysics, is called the Lord of the world or the demiurge. Gnostics taught that this demiurge was the personification of matter, the monad of the material world, and the seed of the world within, and that it had nothing in common with Jesus. Yaldabaoth gave birth out of himself to 6 sons, who together with their father became the 7 planetary spirits, who were called the 7 archons or governors. These correspond with the guardians of the world that were described by Hermes. According to the church father Origen, the names are Yaldabaoth, Saturn; Io, Jupiter; Sabaoth, Mars; Adonius, the sun; Astaphaeus, Venus; Iolaus, Mercury; Oreos, the moon. Yaldabaoth formed the outer boundary of the solar system, the orbit of Saturn, within which the other planets exist as embryos in ascending order of powers. This is the origin of the Greek myth of Saturn devouring his own children, because the ancients believed that planetary substance was finally drawn into the rings of Saturn and from there scattered into space. The following summary of the Gnostic cosmology story of the Gnostics comes from an old text called The Gnostics and Their Remains, Ancient and Medieval by C.W. King, and it was published in 1887. The Gnostics thought of Yaldabaoth and his 6 sons as proud and opposing spirits, similar to the way Christians thought of Lucifer and his rebels. Yaldabaoth and his son wanted to set up a kingdom in the abyss that would prevail against the kingdom of God. According to the Gnostics, the generative wisdom of the world was Sophia Achamoth. Sophia saw her reflection in the deep and was lured into the darkness, where she sought union with it. In so doing, she gave birth to a son, and this was Yaldabaoth, who was both the child of chaos and the egg. Sophia, however, suffered from her contact with matter and struggled to escape it. She was able to reach the middle distance between the heavens above and the material world below, but some of the material elements managed to stick to her spiritual nature. She cleansed her being, but then undertook to build a strong barrier between the world of spirit, which is above, and the world of ignorance and matter, which is below. Yaldabaoth, as the son of chaos, became the creator of the physical part of the world. In this part of the world, sin prevailed temporarily as darkness overtook the light of virtue. Yaldabaoth produced, out of his own being, 6 planetary spirits who were his sons. They were fashioned in his own image. As each receded farther from their father, they became progressively darker. Yaldabaoth and his 6 sons inhabit 7 regions, with the 7th region the sphere of ether. Yaldabaoth inherited from his mother, representative of generating wisdom, instinct, cunning, and the realization of the universal immensity. From his father, representative of matter, he inherited ambition and pride. Yaldabaoth chose to cut himself off from his mother and create a world according to his own desires where he could rule as lord and master. He then created man. Man would hail matter as his lord and never seek beyond that material sphere or endeavor to find light. Yaldabaoth's plan ultimately failed, however, because the man he created was a creature without a soul, a monstrous creature, so much that the 6 sons captured him and begged their father to give it a soul. However, the demiurge could not create life, only forms, so he gave the creature the ray of divine life he had inherited from his own mother. This was how man gained the power of generative wisdom, and as a result, he beheld himself equal to his creator, Yaldabaoth. This was a punishment upon Yaldabaoth for his own pride. Humanity now contained the light of Sophia, and followed the impulse of that light and collected it into itself, and divided light from the darkness of matter. By doing this, man transformed himself into the image of the Supreme Being as opposed. The Supreme Being that he opposed. He no longer resembled Yaldabaoth. Of course, this enraged Yaldabaoth, who gazed down into the great abyss, and by his reflection gave rise to Satan in the form of a serpent. Yaldabaoth also sought to detach man from his spiritual guardian, his mother. He created a labyrinth of snares and delusions all around him. In each sphere of the world, then, grew a tree of knowledge. Yaldabaoth did not want man to learn the mysteries of the superior worlds, and so forbade him to eat from the fruit of the tree. To counter this, Sophia sent her genius Ophis in the form of a serpent to assist man. Because man ate of the tree of knowledge, he became capable of comprehending the mysteries of nature. Yaldabaoth's revenge for this was to imprison man and women in a dungeon of matter. Physical bodies encased their spirits. Even so, Sophia continued to supply them with a current of divine light, which protected man's spiritual nature, even while his physical body wandered in the darkness. The battle between Sophia Achamoth and Yaldabaoth continued. Sophia Achamoth ascended to the feet of her celestial mother, the heavenly Sophia, which is the wisdom of God, and asked the all-knowing to prevail upon the unknown depth, the everlasting Father, to send down into the underworld the Christos. The Christos was the son of the union of the Father of fathers and heavenly wisdom. While this was taking place, Yaldabaoth and his 6 sons of matter were weaving a web around themselves which would inevitably shut out the divine wisdom of the gods. They did this so mankind would perish in darkness. Because the higher gods could not create bodies, Yaldabaoth himself had to be secretly coaxed into creating a body to receive the Soter Christus. Sophia Achamoth appealed to the pride of the demiurge and was able to convince him to prove his powers by creating a good and just man named Jesus. The Soter Christus then descended through the spheres of the 7 archons, and as he did this, in each world he called upon the sparks of light to come out of the darkness and join him. He united all the light of the worlds in his own nature, and then the Christos descended into the man Jesus at his baptism. In order to create chaos, once he realized what had happened, Yaldabaoth stirred up the people against Jesus and finally succeeded in destroying Jesus' physical vehicle. But before Christos left the earth, he implanted in the souls of just men an understanding of the great mysteries. This opened forever the gate between the lower and the higher universes. The story is completed this way. Thence, ascending into the middle space, Christ sits on the right hand of Yaldabaoth, but unperceived by him, and there collects all the souls which shall have been purified by the knowledge of Christ. When he has collected all the spiritual light that exists in matter out of Yaldabaoth's empire, the redemption will be accomplished, and the world will be destroyed. Such is the meaning of the reabsorption of all the spiritual light into the pleroma, or fullness, whence it originally descended.